Nigel fights for the Ashes. Nigel Nutkin was an unassuming man in his mid-twenties. His main passion was cricket. When he was a boy, he dreamed that one day he would fight for the Ashes against a hated foe, the Aussies. Little did he realise that his dream would come true one day, but not in the sporting sense. The Nutkins lived in a quiet, leafy suburb where nothing much happened. There were no gangs outside on the streets, no burglaries and no noise to disturb their quiet lives. The Nutkins were well off and lived in a six-bedroom house with its own drive, a large pond and well-tended lawns, and nestling in the middle of the back garden a cricket pitch. All of this was diligently tended by their private gardener, old Bob. Nigel was the only child, and Nigel Senior had been left a lot of money by his mother and spent most of his days indulged in his favourite hobby, UFOs. He would spend days away driving into the countryside on midnight vigils, convinced that there was an underground colony of ETs in various parts of the country, who would one day join together and invade the world. His mother, Nigella, held a lot of dinner parties for the local dignitaries and their wives. The Nutkins were tolerated rather than liked by the community because they were nerds. They all had protruding teeth, wore glasses, and spoke rather like a squirrel, spitting a lot as they spoke, but because they had money, they were accepted. Nigel had three childhood friends that he had grown up with through thick and thin. He was shunned by most of the pupils at school because of his looks and speech, but Big Jim, an oaf of a boy who came from a large family and who didn't really know where he was most of the time, and the twins, Buddy and Billy, who came to the school from a family of travellers and were taunted with the usual jibes of peg sellers, thieves and rapists. They struck up a bond with Nigel, and together they survived their school years. The Nutkins had a cottage in Norfolk. It had 4 bedrooms, a large kitchen and dining area, and an orchard at the back. Because his parents were so busy with their individual pursuits, Nigel, in the summer, had the run of the place and kept up the maintenance. He also worked in the village at a local newspaper as a cricket reporter. He was a bright man, as most nerds are, and his witty reports on cricket in general were eagerly awaited by the locals, thus trebling the circulation of the paper. He also had a generous allowance from his father and purchased a 6-berth caravan which he installed at the back of the cottage, which was the home of his 3 friends, who also had the run of the cottage when he was there. The trust between them was so great that they retreated to the caravan when Nigel went home for the winter. The twins were good at making things and set up a stall in the town, and together with some night poaching they survived. Big Jim worked as a doorman at the social club and did a bit of furniture removals to eke out his existence. All 3 of them had no overheads, so they were happy. It was just a case of surviving the cold winters of the fens. When the gang was all together, Nigel would try and educate his men on the finer points of cricket, and they were further encouraged because Australia were coming to try and regain the Ashes from their old enemy, England.
What are the Ashes?
Asked Big Jim one night when they were all sitting in the garden at the cottage.
The ashes are kept in a casket, and they came from the very first match between the two countries. The stumps were burned and put in the casket,
replied Nigel. Little did Jim and the others know that they would be getting up close and personal to said item in the near future.
I see Mrs. Green is letting her house out this summer while she's away in Scotland,
said Nigel Senior one night around the dinner table.
They're moving in tomorrow, apparently.
I hope they fit into the ambience of the street,
replied Nigella. Nigel Senior just sniffed and kept on eating. Mrs. Green lived 2 houses away in a house that was far too big for her. It had 4 bedrooms and a large balcony at the front. She had 2 cats and a budgie called Fred, who had the foulest of mouths. Her grandson Ned had taught him some choice words, and Mrs. Green had banned him and his friends from her house, and had tried in vain to prevent Fred from swearing. In 3 days' time, Nigel would be joining his friends at the cottage to plan the trip to Edgbaston for the first test against the Aussies. The tickets were already on their way. Nigel strolled down the road and approached Mrs. Green's house. His attention was drawn to the balcony, where a thick-set man with a large hat with corks dangling from it stood, surveying the scene. Nigel's mouth shot open.
"Hello, mate!"
came the dreaded sound from the balcony. The voice invaded Nigel's brain, and he leapt back in startled amazement.
"A bloody Aussie!"
Nigel then exclaimed, finding his voice.
"You all right, mate?"
inquired the large Aussie.
"You look unsteady on your pins there." "Who's that drongo down there, Dad?"
came another Aussie voice from the balcony. A scrawny-looking lad then emerged, wearing a yellow T-shirt with a kangaroo pictured on it.
"He's a neighbour from up the road a piece,"
came the reply. Nigel still stood there with his mouth open, trying to come to grips with what stood before him. The large man was still talking.
"Yeah, we're over for the test, and we've come to take the ashes back with us." "Ha, yeah."
He laughed.
"You a cricket fan?"
"Yes,"
Nigel stammered.
"Good."
The Aussie exclaimed.
"You want to come in for a tinny?"
he asked.
"No thanks, I'm busy at the moment,"
replied Nigel, regaining his senses.
"Maybe later."
On the way to the cottage, Nigel's brain was racing. How many are there? Do they have friends elsewhere? Will they have Barbies? When they see we have a cricket pitch, will they invite themselves over and challenge us? His mind was in turmoil as he entered the back garden of the cottage and motioned to his friends to join them. They were all sitting outside the caravan, taking in the bright rays of the sun.
"What's up, Nige?
"Asked Billy."
You look troubled."
"I am,"
replied Nigel.
"Aussies, bloody Aussies, and moved in down the road.
He shouted.
They're here for the test." "How many?"
asked Buddy.
"I don't know. I only saw 2 of them. There could be a whole family."
"We'll go and sort them.
rasped Jim.
Let 'em know we don't stand for any aggro."
"No,
replied Nigel.
that's just what these people live for. Fighting is what they do. It's their hobby. Guile is what we need, and cunning."
"I agree.
replied Billy.
Me and Buddy were brought up all our lives relying on our cunning. That's how we survived moving from town to town."
"Yes, we will invite ourselves over and navigate the lie of the land,"
replied Nigel. Nigel frequently invited his friends to his home, and so it wasn't surprising to Nigella when the 4 of them trooped into the living room.
"Hello, boys.
She piped up.
I'll make some sandwiches."
"Thanks, Mrs. Nutkin. Where's Mr. Nutkin?"
asked Jim.
Oh, he's off looking for UFOs. I don't know what he does if one landed in front of him. He'd probably invite them home.
Nigel laughed. Nigel had more serious things on his mind.
We'll be in the garden, mother,
He said sternly. In the garden a plan was made whereby Jim, being the biggest, and Nigel would invite themselves into Mrs. Green's and take a lie of the land tomorrow. The day dawned, and with purpose Nigel and Jim approached the front door of Mrs. Green's and knocked. After a few seconds the door opened, and the large man Nigel had seen earlier stood there bedecked in a Hawaiian-looking shirt, white slacks and sandals.
"Hiya, cobbers! Come in and meet the family!"
He boomed. Once inside, they were ushered into the living room and offered juice or coffee. They both took orange juice and sat down.
"My name's Pick, after Picky Ronding, the Aussie captain."
Boomed Pick. Two men and a woman entered the room.
"This is Wayne, after Wayne Shawn, our wonderful spinner, and that's Lot, after Lotsy, our fast bowler. And this is Miss Sheila Bonner. She was named after the greatest batsman ever, Bon Dradman."
Up yours!
Came a voice from the corner, and they turned and saw Fred the budgie in his cage. Everyone laughed except Nigel, who frowned.
"That budgie just fits in nicely with our family.
Laughed Pick.
We're loud, proud, and cricket mad."
Is this all of you?
Asked Nigel, regaining his composure.
"Yeah, although we'll meet up with some friends at Lord's and invite 'em over for a barbie later,"
Replied Bonner. Jim was eyeing up Wayne and Lot meanwhile. I think I could take them both, he said to himself. After about an hour of banter and fact-finding about the two families, Nigel and Jim left.
"What a couple of drongos!
Exclaimed Wayne.
If they're all like them, this is going to be a breeze." "Shut your mouth and keep it shut.
Roared Pick.
You'll tell nobody and give no clues to anybody why we're here." "OK, Pop."
Stammered Wayne. Back at the house, Nigel couldn't contain his excitement.
Remember when we were kids?
He blurted out to the group.
We made plans and different strategies on how to keep one step ahead of the bullies.
Yeah.
Agreed the others.
Well, we've got to do the same here.
Nigel went on. What do you suggest? Asked Buddy.
We've got to somehow get inside the house to see if something untoward is going on. I don't trust Aussies,
Retorted Nigel. Look, me and Billy know a bit about breaking and entering, said Buddy. If you tell us what we're looking for and get the family over here for a few hours, we'll do the job.
excellent.
Replied Nigel.